Welcome. If you're new to Morbid Anatomy, my name is Joanna Ebenstein. I'm the founder and creative director of Morbid Anatomy. I run Morbid Anatomy with my colleagues Leticia Barbier and Christina Marcello, who is silently here recording as well. If you're new, I also want to let you know that we do all sorts of things online and in person. We have online lectures like this one every Monday night and often on weekends. We do online classes, virtual classes, and in fact, tonight's speaker will be giving a class that is an expansion on the material that he's presenting in today's talk. I'll put that in the chat a little bit later. We also have an open to the public library in Brooklyn, New York, if you ever make it there, and we have a flea market. Well, I'll tell you about the flea market in a moment, but I want to tell you about a few directly upcoming events. First, tonight we have a free collection show and tell, and so this is a new series that we're putting together for our higher level Patreon members. It's a free collection show and tell and meet and greet with cocktails, and we're inviting people to bring objects from their own collection. We'll be inviting collectors to share as hosts for different events. Tonight, it will be my colleague Leticia and I sharing some objects from our collection and inviting people to share objects from their collection. On Sunday, May 22nd, we have The Death Drive on Film by Mary Wild with another talk called The Revolution Will Go Viral on Sexting, the Digital and Contagion with Dr. Clint Burnham. And this is part of our Art and the Occult series, which is an ongoing series we do with Vanessa Sinclair and Carl Abramson. And on Saturday, May 28th, we have the Morbid Anatomy Flea Market at Industry City. So if you're around Brooklyn, please check it out. I'll put a link in the chat to where you can find out more about all of these things if you'd like. And I also want to say, as you can probably see, we're recording today's lecture, and we record about 90%, 95% of the lectures that we present here at Morbid Anatomy. If you're a member on our Patreon, for $5 a month, you have access to the entire backlog of lectures, including exclusive articles, interviews, and all sorts of other things. I'll put a link in the chat if you're interested, and it also supports what we do here. So I thank you for your consideration. I want to say also, as you probably noticed, people won't be able to show their faces or speak out loud, but we do welcome your questions in the chat. There'll be a time, as soon as the lecture's over, we'll be asking people to bring their questions and I'll share them with the speaker. And so I want to get started. I want to introduce today's speaker. So today's speaker is Jason Lahman, who is a visual artist, sculptor, poet, and cultural historian. He studied illustration at Parsons Parsons School of Design and Art History at the New School in New York City. He holds an MA in Modern European History with an emphasis on the history of science and technology from SF State University, where he taught in the humanities department. He completed his PhD coursework in the history of science at the University of California, Davis, and has lectured widely on the topic of technology and visual culture, with a special emphasis on early cinema and automata. He is currently based in Portugal, where he maintains a full-time studio art practice. So I'm going to hand it over to Jason. As I said, please feel free to put questions in the chat at the end of the talk. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jason. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Joanna. It's so good to be back and very excited about the opportunity of giving the full course, A Cultural History of Robots, starting at the middle of next month. So the topic that we're going to be looking at today is a big one, and it's certainly not going to be an exhaustive history of gender and technology or gender and the living machine. But I hope it's going to give us a lot to work with and a lot to think about. And I hope that it also will dovetail with your interests in the audience. And also, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them and also happy to direct you to the sources that I've been working with, and I look forward to your feedback. So before we begin, I want to say one thing about this. The main thing that I really want to get at is trying to understand the nature of intelligent machines and the technologies that we think of as robotic currently. And in order to think about that, the dilemmas we're facing, the new processes that we're trying to understand, we have to really understand how we got here. I am a historian trained in the history of Europe, focusing mostly on the early modern and the modern period. I have a special interest in the 19th century. And so a lot of this is going to be skewed towards Europe and North America. But I want to point out that in order to understand how we got to where we are today, we have to really understand how technology has been gendered over the last 200 and 300 years in the West. And because those are the cultures that have dominated the discourse for so long. That's changing, and it's changing rapidly. And towards the end of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the new work that's being done, and a lot, hopefully, of the new methodologies that are allowing us to understand in a more deep way how to take this apart and how to think about what a new type of technology that departs from a lot of these old gender norms would provide for us. And in that is also going to be hopefully a way for thinking about how gender and race and class are deeply, deeply interconnected. So without further ado, let's get started. So when we're trying to get at gender and the idea of the living machine, I want us to be seeing forms that echo or repeat across time. We're going to be reading context around forms in their own time. So thinking about how specific types of machines, specific ways of thinking about them in relationship to gender are embedded in their time and place. And hopefully this will also get us to thinking about how these things, which very often seem so obvious to us, I mean, I would say that most of the people in the audience today know that they're not obvious, but I would say to the general public, they seem to be obvious. So I want us to be thinking about how these things are sort of hidden, are connected through sort of hidden networks of meaning and connection. So we're going to be looking at gender and machines in terms of tasks, in terms of tools, in terms of physical analogies, which can also be quite comical. We're going to be talking about male makers of artificial life, because overwhelmingly the people who have at least in modern culture, been in charge of making these types of machines, writing about them and reflecting on them, are male and mostly white. I want us to be thinking about modern life in the West and its relationship to gender around things like robots and AI. We're going to be looking at the end of the talk on this anxiety around replacement, which has major ramifications if we're paying attention to what's going on in United States politics now in issues of race and politics. And then at the end, I want to be touching on things like transgenderism and gender fluidity. And also methods of not thinking about materials and technologies that are non-Western. These things have a direct ramification around the dismantling of racism. So technology, this is a quote, technology is the tangible expression of desire, motivating human imagination to modify reality. And I think there's a sort of a broad anthropological, I don't want to call it a truth, but something that we can see when we look across sort of all human societies. And it's any type of technology that human beings are engaged in creating is going to be brought into being because it's going to help accomplish some kind of a fantasized wish or to save time and effort. So for example, if I want to keep my food from spoiling, I'm going to be utilizing technologies of preservation. If I want to build something, or if I want to protect myself from the elements, I'm going to be utilizing things that are tools, that are materials, in new ways, or very often ways that have been handed down to me in order to bring about the betterment of my human existence, right? So technology, tools, these things all are aspects of the human drive to make life more livable and to also, as we'll see, fulfill specific desires. There's a quote that I always like to give to my students, and that it was attributed to Mark Twain. We know now that he didn't say it, but you'll certainly find it attributed to him in print and then also all over the internet. I think it's wonderful. History may not repeat, but it does rhyme. A friend of mine refers to this as the historical echo, and I like that because I think even though understanding history doesn't always give us a way to predict the future, I do think understanding history helps us to understand echoes and to see how those echoes are embedded in time and how they do repeat. Because again, history doesn't repeat, but there are definitely rhymes. So two of the things that we're going to look at first of all are the idea of the artificial lover, So that's something that's being created in order to offer a satisfaction in sex, love, or companionship. And then also the artificial servant. So leisure, safety, freedom. These are things that contemporary AI and contemporary robotics are constantly being utilized to address. And so again, if we're thinking about the sort of genealogy of these ideas in Western science, we have to go back to the classical past, because Western science, Enlightenment science, the science in America and North America over the last 200, 300 years is obsessed with the classical. And of course, if we know our history of science and technology, we know that the West, as it has been imagined, sees itself as the inheritor. If you take my class, or if you saw my last lecture, A Cultural History of Robots from Myth to Modernity, you know that the story is much more complicated than that. And you know that the modern West has not always paid credit where credit is due. And the Arab world, the Islamic worlds of the High Middle Ages and of the Renaissance preserved and augmented and added to and brought their own traditions to a lot of these things. And those things have not always been acknowledged. They are, to a greater and greater degree being acknowledged in the West. But that's something that we'll talk a lot more about in the course. So back to this idea of the artificial lover. If you read, if you study or read about sex bots or artificial AI companions, very often they will go back to the myth of Pygmalion. Pygmalion is the sculptor who falls in love with his own creation, Galatea, the statue that in the earliest sources is carved from pure ivory. And he falls in love with her, so much so that he offers prayers to the goddess Aphrodite or to Venus, and she brings his artificial lover to life. This story is picked up and utilized by the Romantics, particularly E.T. Hoffmann in his Tales of Hoffmann. And later on that is pulled into the opera, The Tales of Hoffmann, and to great comic effect. And in the 19th century, as automata are becoming something that people are seeing more and more, particularly in Europe, the idea of the woman who may or may not be an artificial creature is used for comedic effect on the stage. But it's also something that is coming up in Romantic literature, and it is tied into this idea of the uncanny. So this male anxiety about trying to find the perfect woman, but not knowing if that's really possible. And when he does find his perfect partner, is there a possibility that she might not actually be human after all? And certainly in the story of the Tales of Hoffmann, she's not. She's a clockwork woman that has been created to fool him. This theme is certainly a part of cinema, and I want to talk about a couple of contemporary films that get into this. In the next two that I'm going to look at, the artificial partner doesn't really have a body. They are an AI. So Her is really, really a fascinating exploration of this. A man falling in love with a female AI, no body, but the voice is there, right? The algorithm, which has been evolved to such a point that she can respond. And this gets into the idea of the Turing test. He's fooled into feeling that she really is conscious. Or maybe she is. We don't really know for sure. I just watched Marjorie Prime, which I would highly recommend. It's a really beautiful film starring Lois Smith as an older woman who has Alzheimer's, and John Hamm as the avatar of her dead husband. Something that's very interesting about this is the avatar, which walks around the apartment and that she can see, is a transparent thing. So there is a body, there is a thing that she can see moving around the house in the form of her husband in his prime, when he's in his beautiful 30s or early 40s, but she can't touch him. And I find that really interesting. So this automaton, this robot figure, which is sort of there, but which is in a sense a hologram. I was reminded of a conversation I had with my own grandfather right before he died, when he was in his 90s. And I said, "Grandpa, how old do you feel on the inside?" And he said, "Oh, about 35. And so it's interesting because in this story, as Marjorie interacts with this AI based on her dead husband. It's not the older version of him, it's the younger version. I want to talk a little bit about the sex bot or the living doll, because that's something that is becoming a reality. You're looking at images of two prototypes, Harmony and Henry, that this company, also known as Abyss, has been working on for the last 15 years. We're going to talk more about them in a minute. If you're interested in learning more about either of these two dolls, which have AI components for response, for both relationship simulation as well as sexual simulation, there's a lot online. There's a really interesting article that was written by Emma Gray Ellis that came out in 2019. And in it, she talks about the Henry version of this sex bot. And his AI, his algorithmic programming is based on harmonies. So they took the female AI and put it into the male robot as they developed him. And there's this whole discussion about the anxiety and the complications this is creating, because there's this feeling that he has not become fully heteronormative male, right? He's exhibiting aspects that are identified with the female AI. And the company is working on dolls for a queer audience and a non-heteronormative buyer. But because all of this has to be engineered, it gets into a very, very interesting discussion about, well, how do we do this? Do we have the customer get very, very specific about the hetero, homo, trans normativity of the thing that they're going to be ordering? And because we're starting from an engineering point of view, and not from the point of view of a living person, it becomes very, very interesting and very complicated, and is actually, I think, creating a kind of a feedback loop. Because as we start to dismantle ideas about gender and sexuality, this is being reflected in how these sorts of things are being designed, and it's causing a lot of sort of a wonderful consternation on the part of these very often heterosexual men, to start to really question how they're creating these things in a dialogue with the people that are consuming them, who up till this point have been heterosexually identified men. Two texts that I would highly recommend to you if you're interested in this, one's a little more academic than the other, is Falling in Love with Statues by the art historian George Hersey, where he tracks the whole sort of history of what's called, and there's a word for it, agalmatophilia, the love of statues. And then the more popular sort of history of this, bringing it into the contemporary world, Love and Sex with Robots by David Levy, who's also the founder of an annual conference, which I'm actually going to be speaking at later on this year, hopefully, if my paper is accepted. And that is the conference, which is also called Love and Sex with Robots, where not just academics, but also the people who are working on this type of AI, and artists, and anybody who finds this helpful and interesting is offered to come and present their work. So that's sort of a little taste of this idea of the artificial lover. We talked about a little bit about the sort of first classical myth in the West about this, the Pygmalion motif, and how that's being reflected in the sex bot. I want to talk about the artificial servant. You know, I don't know if any of you have a Roomba, the little critter that goes around your place and vacuums for you. But there are also sort of classical and mythological, fantastical antecedents to the Roomba. And one of the first one, to go back to the classical world, are a series of robots that were created by the lame god Hephaestus in Greek mythology. Hephaestus was the smith of the gods. And I have been doing a lot more reading on the new work that's being done on thinking about him in terms of disability rights, the sort of history of disability. He's the only god in Greek mythology who is what we would now call disabled. The use of his legs is impaired when he's thrown out of heaven because he gets between his parents when they're having an argument, and his legs never heal. And so in order to get around, he actually creates a series of robots who help him with his mobility. He creates artificial women who serve him in his laboratory. There's a series of artificial animals that he creates for different kings, and also a series of tripods that move around Olympus and serve the gods. Another artificial servant from Western myth is the golem, and he's created not only to serve Rabbi Loew, but also to protect the Jewish community in Prague. There's something very interesting that people have pointed out about the way that he's programmed. He's programmed with the Hebrew word truth, emet, on his forehead, and when the aleph is removed from that, that spells out death. So there's a kind of a sort of a binary programming in the Kabbalistic sorcery that is used to animate him. Here's a lovely sort of romanticized image of a robot servant from a French magazine from the 1920s. Very similar to the Jetsons' maid. This is from a really interesting, quirky book called Tomorrow Days that was edited by Isaac Asimov that shows, I think the source material are actually a series of illustrations that were published in Paris in the early 1900s. And so you can see the robot maid, and she's controlling the actual maid is controlling the robot maid through a kind of a remote control device that's actually wired to this thing. And this, creates all of this sort of wonderful images of comedy if you look at the whole series of illustrations. Rollo was a fictionalized domestic robot. He didn't actually exist. That was shown at the World's Fair in 1939, 1940. And at a lot of these World's Fairs in the late 19th and early 20th century, this sort of speculative technology, very often which was automatic or robotic, didn't always reflect technology that existed, but it reflected the technology that people hope would exist in the future. And so it's very interesting because the technological imagination is both reflective of technologies that exist, but in going back to that idea about technology as representative of an anthropological desire in human beings, very often points the way for technologies that will come into being. Robot maids in the 1960s, again, reflecting this idea that the post-war housewife would be relieved from her duties and sort of allowed a lot more leisure time to be served by these different sort of robot servants, most of whom were never brought into being. Now, here's an actual robot made from contemporary Japan. I think this is from about 15 years ago. So as we know, there are actual devices, embodied devices that have bodies that have been created for waste management, for cleaning, things like that. They're not always anthropomorphic. Very often the anthropomorphic aspect of things like the artificial servant is used as more of a promotional tool. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that too. It's very important, and this is something that even mainstream tech, I would say, journalists don't always get right in their enthusiasm to cover this stuff. We have to be very aware of how tech companies and futurists are thinking about the actual possibilities of technology, because it is so bound up in the mythology. It is so bound up in the movies and in the speculative promotional types of things that we consume, from toys to, again, to films, right? And it's not always reflective of the actual AI, actual robotic reality, or where this stuff is going. And I think that's something that we always have to be very, very conscious of. I want to talk a little bit about the artificial parent as it's been reflected in two recent film series. One is I Am Mother, which is a film that came out a couple of years ago about a robot mother that is raising an embryo. It's the end of the world, and she has this whole series of embryos, and she's raising them and trying to sort of reprogram humanity, right? And that gets very complicated when a real human shows up and tells the human girl who's being raised by this robot that all is not as it seems. And the similar theme is being explored in Raised by Wolves, a series that I have not finished. I've watched the few episodes of it. And there's a sort of an Adam and Eve character who are cyborgs, who have gone to another world and who likewise are raising human beings that are coming from frozen embryos. Something that we all, again, have to really be conscious of is in Western science and in Western technology, there is a very specific discourse about robots, a very specific anxiety about them as the artificial sort of creation of human beings, and that there's this fear of replacement, and there's also this fear that they will turn and rebel and take over. That's something that's not reflected in the Japanese view of robots, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because there's a very different history of human relationship to automata and to robots in Japan. So the cultural discourse related to the human-robot relationship is something that is so deeply embedded, and it's really embedded, I think, a lot of times in scientists and technologists, people working on the real stuff. It's not to say that these anxieties don't reflect real possible problems, but they also do very often come out of a fictional discourse. We'll talk more about that in a minute. A very loving take on this is a short story that Ray Bradbury wrote in the 1950s called I Sing the Body Electric. And that was adapted twice for film, well, once for television on The Twilight Zone, and then later for a made-for-TV movie. Both of those titled, well, actually, I think the second one was titled The Electric Grandmother. And so the robot that is created comes out of Ray Bradbury's very, very sort of late 19th century romantic sensibility of an artificial grandmother that is, it's actually very moving. She helps to raise the children, but because she doesn't age, when they themselves are old, she returns to them. And so there's this really, I get very emotional about it for some reason. I think it's also because I was very attached to my grandparents. And I also actually did have a friendship with Ray Bradbury. So this story is very personal to me. At the end of the story, the automaton, the electric grandmother, returns to the children, and she takes care of them in old age. So three people who are the age of grandparents are essentially cared for at the end of their lives by their grandmother. Something that is also maybe coming, right, as we think about these human AI relationships, because they won't age the way that we age. One of my favorite films from the 1950s that is reflective of some really interesting things around gender and robotics is Forbidden Planet. I was going to show a clip, but I think I'm going to skip that because there's so much information that I want to get to. But I just want to briefly mention Robbie the robot is asked what his gender, what his sex is by the astronauts who have landed on this planet, where his inventor and his inventor's daughter lives. It's a retelling of The Tempest, where you have this sort of mad, brilliant genius, his beautiful daughter, and the robot, who's kind of a stand-in for the spirit Ariel from The Tempest. And Robbie the robot says, well, in my case, a question about my sex doesn't make sense. And yet, as time goes on, one of the astronauts refers to him as, the line is, you care for us as a mother would. So the idea of the artificial parent, the artificial caregiver, the artificial servant is certainly something that is being reflected in reality when we think about like the artificial nurse. This is an image from almost a decade ago of a battlefield robot. If you follow Boston Dynamics and you understand the deep imbrication of all of these high-tech military industrial companies, a lot of these caregiving robots are very, very much related to taking care of people on the battlefield or post-battle. And that certainly ties into the technologies around robotic surgery. So here's an image of one of these things being able to pick somebody up off of the battlefield after they've been wounded, right? An artificial aide-de-camp, as it were. This is a robot called Moxie that was created by a company that's actually founded by two female roboticists. And I don't think Moxie is necessarily identified with a specific gender, which is very interesting because sometimes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, when people are being taken care of by a robot in a hospital or a recuperation center, depending on the culture, depending on their own age, there's been studies that have been done on this, they will identify the robot with a particular sex, very often female. I don't think Moxie has been labeled as male or female. Moxie has been utilized in the last 2 years, particularly in COVID wards. And so the robot being able to tend to people who have a contagious disease is something that is becoming very, very important right now. It's also complicated because it ties into the idea of the robot replacement of nurses. And as we all know, there is a narrative about there aren't enough nurses. We know that that's not true. And if we listen to what a lot of representatives of the nursing community are saying, we know that that's not true at all. So, but however, this does get complicated because there are types of technologies that are being utilized to replace actual human beings. And the narrative is that it's safer, which it is in certain ways, but it's more complicated than that. Here are the two women, Andrea Thomas and Vivian Chu, who are the founders of Diligent Robotics. There are so many women just in the last 10 years, or we should also say non-male identified people that are coming into the robotics field, and that is changing a lot of how these things are being placed in the world, which is really important to know. Here's two examples of medical robots that aren't coming from the Western world. Shams is a robot nurse from Cairo, and Tommy is a robot nurse from Varese, Italy. I think it's interesting. Shams looks a little bit more female, I think, because of the dress shape. That could also maybe projecting onto that. I don't think Shams has been gendered by the creators. Tommy obviously has with his name. Interesting statistics. According to the State of Women in Tech, in 2020, only 26% of computing jobs are held by women. It's, I think, even lower in robotics. The turnover rate is over twice as high for women than for men in the tech industry. This is really, really an important issue. And we know this. In STEM, there are not enough women, there are not enough non-male identified people. And we know that it's important, obviously, because it's not just about representation, it's obviously about life experience. This is an article that I found really interesting. Bot looks like a lady. Should robots have gender? And this gets into some very specific studies about this robot caregiver convalescing patient relationship. And these studies are really, really important to pay attention to because they differ. They differ by the age of the patient, they differ by culture. But there's a lot of statistical work being done on studying how people identify with their robots if they are or are not gendered. I want to point your attention to Jennifer Robertson's work. She is an anthropologist and an artist, she's many things, who's written a really interesting book called Robo Sapiens Japanicus. And she is one of the folks who really brings to the fore the very, very different history that robots have in Japan. And she looks at the 19th century with the tea-serving robot, with the deep connection that robots have there with the theater, with puppetry, and also how that has played out in the post-World War II relationship of humans to robots. And she brings up some really important stuff. Not only is this a very important anthropological, ethnographic history of robots in Japan, but she points out this whole thing about, I think it's the Disney term, Imagineering. The way that a robot is Imagineered comes out of a very specific set of historical precedents that have already been in place, mostly through science fiction, mostly through speculative fiction, and in the case of Japan, in the all-male, all-female theater traditions, which are very often also connected to puppetry. Really, really fascinating book. I highly, highly recommend her work. Likewise, two other books about robots in Japan, one about post-war human relationships with robots is The Japanese Robot Culture. And then one of my favorites, Loving the Machine, The Art and Science of Japanese Robots. And one of the things that I want to bring up, that both of these books really get into, is that why is it that in Japan robots are not seen as menacing? Because they're not. They're seen as the Donna Haraway term, as companion species, right? They're not things that are going to take over and kill us or that want to usurp our jobs or our position. Very, very different modern mythology of the human-robot relationship, even though the gendering is still very, very traditional, right? And again, drawing on the work of Jennifer Robertson, I want us to be thinking that gender as it is imagined or representative is very different than the way it is actually experienced. That holds true all across the world in all different times and places, right? The way that we talk about gender is very often different than the way that it is experienced and lived by the individual. That just goes without saying. Well, actually, no, it doesn't go without saying, does it? We need to say that. We need to keep saying that. And likewise, I think we can analogize that and bring that over to the robot as it is imagined or represented. Is very different than the way that the robot is actually experienced. So again, if we're pulling this back to sort of Western culture, I want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the underpinnings of sort of gender theory. This comes out of a lot of Judith Butler's work, right? The idea of gender as performed. And, that doesn't deny, that we have bodies, that we have, particular types of, of biologies and all of the science that goes along with that, right? But these things are deeply, deeply interconnected and have been described in different ways and different times. So we have to think about gender as being a socially constructed thing in relationship to actual bodies, right? And the traditions of how those bodies are gendered. So I want us to be thinking about two ideas in terms of Western technology and scientific tradition as it relates to gender. Technology and science in the West, and by that I mean Western Europe and mostly North America, technology and science are gendered as masculine fields. And very often the object of desire, the object of study is feminine. Even if you go back to the works of Francis Bacon in the early modern period, he uses a lot of rape and what's the word that ravishment, which is rape, right? Non-consensual sexual metaphors to think about the taking of nature, the prying it apart, so that she will reveal her secrets. I think he even uses a torture analogy. It's sort of horrific. But that's there at the very beginnings of a lot of these scientific discourses. We can't deny that. That's historical. And then I want us to be thinking about this sort of Western binary of gender in relationship to abstract thought or observation as an impressing agent, an extracting and an impressing upon agent, right? And then the female is very often seen, or the feminine is seen as a concreteness or a body that's torn apart, that's impressed, that is the object of study. And I did this interesting exercise. I Googled great men of science, and I was hit with a barrage of textbooks, popular as well as academic, published over the last 100 years that have that title. Not so many of great women of science, That's something that very often you will find in, thank goodness now, in the gift shops of contemporary science museums and obviously in libraries to really get particularly, female identified children to understand that there have been women in science, but it's a pretty new thing, unfortunately. Again, and Joanna, was thinking about your book, The Anatomical Venus, when I looked at this. This is an image by Albrecht Dürer, the artist and his model. The artist who's drawing his female subject is looking through that wonderful Renaissance grid system, right? And if you know the film, The Draftsman's Architect, in which that object is used, This is not only a real tool, used by artists, but it is also very evocative of a whole range of tools for the observing of the female subject or the scientific subject, breaking it down into parts, reassembling it, right? The body being transformed into some kind of data, which is then, impressed, in this case, onto actual paper. And nothing, of course, is a better example of this whole idea than these images of Charcot demonstrating a hysterical patient in front of his students at the Paris hospital in 1887. So, we see this over and over again in the 19th century, the idea that it's the male gaze, it is the male scientific rational mind, which is observing the female patient. Obviously, there are also occasionally, usually high-ranking women studying science. If you know the story of Anne Lister, Gentleman Jack, wonderful series, she's studying science on her own. She's engaged in this, but she cannot be in this male audience. She's a little bit earlier than this, but this is an all-male audience. And so when we're talking about gendering the living machine, metaphors around thinking about machines are playing into this sort of medicalization of the female body. An interesting a couple of people to think about in the relationship of technology and AI and coding, of course, are Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter. Again, two elite people, but a man and a woman who work together. And also, Ada was able to do this. She's considered in many ways the mother of computer programming. She was a mathematician, as was her mother before her, Lord Byron's wife. But they were aristocrats, and they were wealthy. They were able to pursue this on their own. There's that wonderful line from The Little Foxes where Betty Davis's character says to her brother, "Oh, Ben, you're going to be very rich, and the rich can be as eccentric as they like." So science at this point in time, particularly with women, is very often the domain of people who can afford to do this. They're sort of removed from that. So Charles Babbage is creating something called the difference engine, the analytical engine, which is one of the first analytical computers. And Ada is creating the mathematical programming language which this thing will operate with. A lot of it's speculative. Charles Babbage's work was not completed in his lifetime. So they're very important. A man and a woman working together to create not only one of the first computers, but also the computer language to run it. There's a very interesting story about Charles Babbage. After he had made his money, he was also considered a great host and a great dinner guest. He could be quite obnoxious, but he was always very interesting. He had two salons in his home. One of them housed the difference engine, this analytical machine, and the other one housed a really beautiful automaton called the Silver Dancer, which he was obsessed with automata when he was a young man. And he had rescued this automaton, which didn't work. It was a woman dancing, and he had repaired it on his own. And so in his mansion, you would see these two living rooms, one containing the difference engine, the other one containing the Silver Dancer. And I think there's sort of a beautiful sort of metaphor for thinking about the sort of mechanical mind and the male thinker, right? Which is something that we'll see coming up over and over again. And also this mechanical female body, right? So the analytical male mind, and then the female as a mechanical body. So I want to quickly look at this idea of gender and its relationship to machines and tools in the West. This is very interesting. So going back to the classical, Greeks, but also if you think about the Middle Ages, women are connected to weaving and sewing. And if you do genealogical work in the United States or Europe, your mother's line is called the distaff side, and your father's line is called the spear side. So you've got sort of thinking about the genealogy, literally the genealogical work that people are doing, identified with two types of tools and their parents. And that's, of course, because the spinning wheel and spinning in the West has been identified with the work of women. We know that, of course, is totally arbitrary, because if you go to places like Peru, many of the indigenous folks there it's the men who will do a specific types of weaving or knitting. That's associated also with a kind of a male, a lineage connection, right? So here we have images of indigenous Peruvian guys who are making hats, not just for themselves, but there's a tradition of them also making them for their sons and grandsons. And obviously, if you look across the world, this gendering of tools, this gendering of particular types of labor is very, very fluid. I have a personal memory, again, in thinking about my dad, who's a very, very sort of traditional, butch, conservative, macho dude. He was a sailor. And so I remember as a very small child, my father sewing buttons onto my shirt. And I remember as a very small boy having a little bit of cognitive dissonance. His mother was a quilter, his mother crocheted. I associated that type of thing with the feminine. And then to see, you know, my big burly dad come home from his construction job and sit down when my mother wasn't home and actually stitch some buttons was a surprise to me, because I, in my young mind, had already identified that type of work with masculinity. Well, as we know, sailors have a long history of sewing. And so again, the work that needs to be done is very often, you know, just done by who's ever there. And these then can be associated with a particular gender, but it's ridiculous to make the assumption that it should be that way. Blacksmithing. I've just discovered a wonderful blog called Working the Flame, which is the whole history of women blacksmiths. There's a long, rich history of this. And yet again, we very often identify that work with the traditional masculinity in the West, right? Well, certainly post-war America, advertising, the Mad Men era is filled with this gendering of machines, domestic machines, women in sewing, and it's always very, you know, patronizing. Can you boil an egg? Then you can make and embroider this blouse with a 1957 Elma, of course. And we all know there's something very interesting that's happening in this period in the United States, where women have, you know, been in the factories. They've been doing this very, very heavy type of labor with machines, and then they're forced out of it when the guys come home. It's all arbitrary, isn't it? Same thing. The Toro, the lawnmower, identified with men in post-war America in all the advertising. And you see this interesting thing. I love these images that are in the early modern Baroque period of the human being, the trade, identified in a sort of fanciful costume way with the tools of the trade. And here you have a man and a woman being shown with the traditional tools of their trade. There's also these marvelous images of men and women as conglomerations of the tools of their trades that you find in these, if you know the work of Arcimboldo, it's the similar idea, to create an individual out of a conglomeration of the tools of their trade. Of course, if you think about what AI and robotics and the cyborg are, right? A conglomeration of parts. And if we're really thinking about things like systems theory and biology, there is no real individual. We are also an interlocking, you know, system of parts. And it is sort of this, this sort of liberal Western tradition of thinking about us as a, you know, one indivisible being. If you haven't read Homo Deus, the sequel to Sapiens by Yuval Harari, I highly recommend it. He gets into that, this whole idea of really challenging, particularly in relationship to what's coming with human AI relationships, really challenging ourselves to stop thinking of ourselves as individuals and much more as interlocking systems. Two wonderful scholars who've worked on this, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and then also the brilliant Sherry Turkle. The meaning of things, domestic symbols in the self. This is a whole series of studies that were done in Chicago in the last half of the 20th century on everyday people's relationships to the objects in their home. Not high-tech objects, but just, you know, things like dishes, things like furniture. And then Sherry Turkle does this with technological devices, telephones, computers. I believe there's even an interview that she does with somebody in their relationship that they have with their dialysis machine, right? Human machine relationships and how these are connected to our bodies. And of course, in the sort of sexist, but also I would say deeply, if we're thinking about the history of comedy, the deeply comedic absurdist and very often sexist gendering of machines, right? So the headlights, right? All of these sort of sexualized, very often sexist terminologies for different parts of the body that are reflected in the specific components of machines. The body is also a machine. And so the euphemism for the part of the machine is a way that we make a joke, right? The sexy woman on the bike, which those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s saw these images, certainly on a lot of the walls of the mechanics shops, right? Likewise, the sexualized male. And even, I got a spare tire, right? The hose and the fireman. I thought this was funny. The knockers. And if you go back to ancient Rome, you remember those marvelous erect phalluses, which were sometimes, wind chimes or bells and temples. So human beings have this wonderful, long anthropological history of thinking about their body parts in relationship to tools and to machine parts, right? Sweetheart was a very sexist coffee machine that Clayton Bailey made at UC Berkeley. There was a big pushback from women in the department, and they actually ended up removing it. Clayton Bailey never did quite, maybe I don't know if he's still living. At the time, he was furious about it, and he cried foul and infringement of free speech, but the women in the department were not having it. So Sweetheart was removed. Ooh, Stanley Kubrick, think about A Clockwork Orange, the Korova milk bar, these hallucinogenic milk dispensers, the milk pouring forth from them, which actually also has sort of an interesting connection to some of these images of the Virgin Mary in the Middle Ages, where she is dispensing milk to male saints who have gone into states of ecstasy. This is my rifle, this is my gun, this is for fighting, this is for fun. The chant that is repeated in Full Metal Jacket. The actor playing the Marine sergeant in this was an actual Marine sergeant. And so again, the connecting of the genitalia with the gun, something that's very, very deeply embedded, and in this case, obviously related to connecting sex and violence. Two great books on the history of thinking about machines as bodies. The Human Motor, which gets into the idea of fatigue in the modern age. It's very, very difficult to escape from this idea of the human-machine analogy. We are machines, machines are bodies. Usually it's the other way around, although that's changing somewhat. I want to talk a little bit about the male maker and the artificial womb. So Dr. Karen Horney came a little bit after Freud, but she really pushed back on this idea of penis envy. And she said, no. It's not penis envy that we should be focusing on, it's womb envy, right? Men actually, on some deep level, are very envious or in a state of anxiety about the fact that they can't create life. This is a quote from Dr. Karen Horney. Is not the tremendous strength in men of the impulse to creative work in every field precisely due to their feelings of playing a relatively small part in the creation of living beings, which constantly impels them to an overcompensation and achievement? It's a really, really interesting statement, and one I think that we should think more deeply about. This is a lovely quote along those same lines from Tom Robbins, a wonderful magic realist American writer. I think Tom Robbins is American. Life still begins in the womb. Cocky erections still collapse and lie useless when woman's superior sexuality is finished with them. But men control the divine channels now, and while that control may be largely an illusion, their laws, institutions, and elaborate weaponry exist primarily to maintain it. And of course, if we're paying attention to what's going on in the United States, I'm an American, although I'm living abroad, things are changing very rapidly around who has access to reproductive health and to abortion. This whole thing of the male giving birth, which is reflected in a lot of science fiction, is certainly seen in the classical stories of Zeus, the king of the gods, giving birth. Here he is giving birth to the goddess Athena from his head. Here he is giving birth to the god Dionysus out of his thigh. Now, if we know the history of Greek mythology, we know that there is no such thing as one Greece, right? These are all very, very different cultures across time. Classical Greece is very different than archaic Greece. And very often, the city-states have very, very different lineages of rural mythologies. Athena and Dionysus are much older and are very often, coming to be in different ways. But there are classical traditions which are very patriarchal, in which Zeus is shown giving birth to these other gods, right? Same is true in the Western tradition. Yahweh pulling Eve out of the male, right? Out of his side. Paracelsus, the great medical reformer and mystic, incredibly important, incredibly revolutionary character. A person, I shouldn't say, is a character. But, an inheritor of this incredibly misogynist, sexist tradition. And he is writing a lot about things like the creation of, he was very interested in the idea of spontaneous generation. And he writes a lot about the homunculus because, he believed it was possible to make a human being, or a kind of a human being, in an artificial womb. Goethe carries that over into Faust. Here's a wonderful illustration of, I don't know if this is Faust or his student Wagner. Anyway, it's somebody in the Faust story creating a homunculus. A little guy in the test tube, right? Mary Shelley certainly is working with this, also problematizing it in Frankenstein. If you haven't seen the film Demon Seed, I would highly recommend it. And I don't have time to show the clip, but it's really incredible because it gets into this whole idea of like, who's in charge of who? Male scientist and his wife, the AI that he has created, which while he is gone, takes over the house, impregnates her. The last image is really powerful. The creature is grown outside of her body, but the male scientist is shown cradling this new Ubermensch, and it's the Pietà. It's the male version of Mary cradling the Christ child. It's a beautiful film. It's a disturbing film. It's a very strange film, but one that I think you should see if you're interested in this topic. There's a line in it that just gives me the creeps to no end. It's a wonderful scene where the AI says to him, and this is when he realizes the AI is becoming conscious in a very different way. He says, "When are you going to let me out of this box?" Well, that sent me down a rabbit hole in thinking about the movie Ex Machina. Joanna, you asked me a question when I gave my last talk on robots, a cultural history of robots from myth to modernity. You said, is there a particular image that really sticks with you in the history of this? And I said, yes, and it didn't come to me again until you asked me that. And it's this image from the film Ex Machina in 2015. Spoiler alert, the guy who is sort of being held captive by this crazy inventor who's inventing fembots, gynoids, female automata who have AI consciousness. He stumbles into this room and he finds all of these women, these artificial women, in various stages of dismemberment. And I was so viscerally shaken up by that. And obviously it's gross and it's weird and it's fascinating and it has its own strange beauty on an aesthetic level. But why was I so moved by it? Well, because Bluebeard, Duke Bluebeard's Castle is my favorite opera. And if you know this fairy tale, you know that it has a long history. In the 19th century, so very quickly, Bluebeard is the character who murders all of his wives. And it's sort of the Eve Pandora motif of don't open that door, I'll give you everything, but don't look behind that door. Bluebeard's current wife does, and she sees the dead wives. In the 19th century, this became a very, very popular pantomime thing. Kids would put this on in pantomime. There's all these images of this if you Google Bluebeard pantomime. And it's the dead wives in the closet. And here's a really interesting image from a magazine showing how it was done. The actresses are all lined up behind the bed sheet and putting their heads through it. So sometimes Bluebeard's wives are showed as beheaded with their heads hanging, and sometimes they're just shown sort of hanging in this closet. But that's clearly what this director or art director was drawing on. Here's an image from the opera. If you don't know the opera, I would encourage you all to take a look at it. It's fabulous. Bartók's only opera, Duke Bluebeard's Castle. But here they are, the wives, which are sort of dead and sort of alive, that are in their boxes, their cupboards. And I showed you the Henry and Harmony, the two sex dolls. This is the founder, Matt McMullen. Really interesting guy. He was a sculptor. He founded this company about 15 years ago. And I didn't see this until actually a couple of days ago, but there's a big Vanity Fair article on him from 2015. And here they are in their cupboards. And here he is in the cupboards. They're sort of reversing that, the creator in the cupboard, right? When they're delivered to you, they come in a box, because of course they have to. Well, somebody asked me, you know, why are all of the roboticists men? Because they are, and I have searched high and low in the history of automata and robotics for examples of non-male or female makers. And the only thing that I can find, and I've searched all of the world's mythologies, are witches, or powerful women who are what we would call witches or sorceresses. And mostly what they're doing is they're reanimating the dead. One of the most famous examples of this from classical tradition is, and one of the only ones, is Erichtho, who is this sort of hag who, very, very scary and sinister, who haunts the battlefields, and she reanimates the corpses of the dead. So it's more like the creation of zombies. But if anybody can find any, I would certainly appreciate knowing about it. And again, here, it's very often there's a negative connotation. A woman who is seen as being very dangerous, who is either putting dead bodies or things together to create some kind of a reanimated object. Usually that's up to no good. Here's something actually that's actually positive in the West, of an image of a female creating life in a non-biological way, but it's, again, made by men and it's analogical, right? So it's the medieval iconography of Dame Nature as a craftswoman, as a blacksmith, and here she is sort of hammering out human beings and living things. I want to talk a little bit, we're running out of time, I've got so much to share. This idea, I brought this up in the last talk, and it's this idea of some of the first robots that were created in the modern West were performing automata, and there are male ones, but I want to talk a little bit about the female machines. And these are automata that were made to play the piano. And the most famous one that's still with us is the automaton keyboardist, created by Pierre-Jacques Droz and his family. And you can still see it in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Here she is, you can see the mechanism in the back, and she actually does play the keyboard, but she is the recreation of the very beautiful aristocratic women that would play the piano in these sort of courtly settings. So she is replicating the programmed performing feminine. This is funny. This is really, it's not funny, but it's very interesting. This is an advertisement from when this thing went on display in London. If the poet speaks truth that says music has charms, who can view this fair object without love's alarms? Yet beware, ye fond youths, vain the transports ye feel. Those smiles but deceive you, her heart's made of steel. For though pure as a vestal, her price may be found, drawing in the language of prostitution, and who may have her for 5,000 pounds. So this is a very valuable object. She's very beautiful, but she comes at a high price and she's not real, right? This is from a TV series from the 1960s called My Living Doll, in which Julie Newmar plays a piano playing robot. You know, I don't actually have time to show this, but if you're interested, we'll post the link later when we post the recording of the lecture. It's very interesting because it pulls this performing female piano playing robot right into the post-war American discourse. The machines of intellect, the calculators that are created in the early modern period, are already being connected to sort of the maleness of the intellect. They don't have bodies. They are calculators. They're calculating machines. Here's two examples. The first by Blaise Pascal, the second by Wilhelm Schickard. And we're still running into this when we're thinking about AI, which is very often non-embodied. Very often, not always, as in the case of her, it's feminine, or Siri, although Siri can have male or female voices. But very often that's connected to masculinity. I guess Alexa isn't, so maybe we're changing something about that. But traditionally, it has been masculinized, whereas very often the robot has been feminized very often, and there's a strong connection between those two things. Masculine consciousness, feminine body. Not always, but very often. I would encourage you to see the film Desk Set, done in 1957, because it's about humans being replaced by machines, but the traditional gender roles are very, very, they're being made fun of, but it's complicated. It's a very, very interesting film, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. Katharine Hepburn and her three assistants are women who work in this information company, and they're being replaced by Emmy, an electromagnetic memory and research calculator, but she has a female name. And so there's this very interesting, complicating kind of queering, transgendering thing that's occurring with the role of the women, the role of the machine. The women who do this intellectual labor within this place are all unmarried, and they are all trying to find a man so that they basically can get married and get out of this. A lot here. A lot of very, very great comedic moments. Katharine Hepburn playing a trick on the woman who's setting up Emmy, sabotaging her. So you also get the sort of the women sabotaging each other in order to bring about what they want to bring about. Very, very interesting. Pitting the women against each other. Of course, if you see this film, you have to see Hidden Figures. I'm sure many of you have. The film that was made about the three African-American mathematicians. I think one of them, or maybe two of them, were also engineers. So the stories of these three brilliant African-American women whose stories were not told, but they were all incredibly important in all of the intellectual calculation, the intellectual labor, the mathematical labor that went into the space, the NASA space program. And of course, these women did not get their due until many years later. And really, really important film. But I think a nice pairing, if you're interested in exploring this theme, is Desk Set and also Hidden Figures. Somebody pointed out the other day that if you think about what an algorithm is a set of rules or it's a recipe. But gender is also a set of rules or a recipe. And I would say so is race, because all of these things are inventions of human beings in order to put biological people, into their place in a society so that they can fulfill a role. And in certain societies and civilizations, those things are more liquid. And at certain times and places and civilizations, they're a lot less liquid. But these things always change over time. The recipe is always being changed, very often to suit power, right? Something else that comes up if we're looking at the history of machines and gender in the West is the idea of women as conduits and men as generators. And you see this really, really powerfully in the 19th century when men and women are going to work in factories. Women are put into one place, men are put into the other. Not always, and again, it's very often arbitrary. Images of women in sewing factories, of course, that we know, working women, whether we're talking about, pre-industrial or industrial, women just as much as men have always worked. All human beings have always worked for most of history. And so it's just in certain times and places, gender and labor gets welded together in specific ways. And in the 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution, it gets hardened into very, very specific sort of like gender sets in the factory system. Women in the telephone industry, they are the operators. Men are the overseers. I mean, men are certainly, doing physical labor in the factories, in other factories, but in the communications, in the early telephone system, it's the men that are watching over the women, right? And here are an image of the sort of male overseers, the male engineers, the male technicians at the Rocky Point Transmission Station in 1930. So again, showing you some images from the American telephone history. I want to talk a little bit about the fembot. Again, I've already brought up E.T.A. Hoffmann, the idea of the beautiful female robot in the Romantic period. If you haven't seen the film Tales of Hoffmann, it's hard to find, but it's absolutely beautiful. I think Criterion might have it. It's an opera ballet about the poet being fooled by the beautiful woman who's actually a fembot. The really most important fembot to know about in the sort of Western modern tradition is The Future Eve or Tomorrow's Eve, which was written in the late 19th century. Thomas Edison, a fictionalized Thomas Edison, makes an appearance. And again, it's about a very wealthy man who's in love with a woman who's very beautiful, but she's not his intellectual equal. And he goes to see his friend Thomas Edison. And Edison says, well, my friend, I can help you with that. And they create an exact replica of his beautiful paramour, but who can keep up with him intellectually. So the fantasy woman, who in this case, the guy doesn't want a woman who isn't his intellectual equal, which is often the case when we're talking about the history of the fembot, right? Just a body, just a sexual object, no relationship, no intelligence. This is the reverse. I want the beauty, but I want it to be filled with the intellectual capacity. I want it to be me in female form, right? That's certainly picked up in Metropolis. I know most of you know this. But it's just very bizarre because Maria is sort of this beautiful saintly figure, right? And then when the copy is made, she of course becomes the lascivious dancing Salome, right? So of course the whole Madonna whore thing, but put together through the artificial body. Stepford Wives, haven't seen the remake, must see the original, 1975. Again, pulling on this idea of the perfect wife who also has to be the perfect sexual object, right? There's been a lot of really interesting work done on the relationship of the housewife to objects. There's The Mechanical Brides was an exhibition that was done a little while ago. Marshall McLuhan wrote about it. And a book that I am currently reading, and I would encourage you all to pick up, is The Smart Wife. Yolanda Stringers and Jenny Kennedy are looking at Siri, Alexa, and other smart home devices, right? Most of them are disembodied AI, which are feminized. And they're looking at this history of the Stepford wife. They're looking at the history of the fembot. There's an incredible chapter called Bitches with Glitches, which gets into the whole history of the malfunctioning fembot and looking at that, how that archetype is actually having real world ramifications for the way that AI is being developed and the way that AI is being interacted with. Incredible, important book, just came out, gotta get it. I want to talk, and we're going to be ending in about 5 minutes. I want to talk about the theme of replacement. I know we've been traveling through a lot of different times, a lot of different places. I've brought up the theme of replacement in terms of the anxiety that comes around through, mostly through the 19th century, this idea of the man who's being fooled by the beautiful woman who may or may not be real. This comes up in Metropolis. It comes up in RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, the play written in the 1920s, which gave us the word robot. The idea that a human being is going to be replaced by an artificial robot, automaton, cyborg, android, that really comes to the fore at the late 19th, early 20th century, and it has to do with labor, and it, of course it also has to do with gender, but it really also has to do with labor, and it has to do with race. And if you're paying attention to what's going on in the United States now, this whole idea of the normalizing of the replacement theory, which comes out of the alt-right, but now is very, very much being normalized. And certainly, also has connections to the 19th century. Replacement and AI, replacement and robotics, this is a very deep, entangled history, and very often it's connected to gender, but also to race. The wonderful director Jordan Peele has explored this twice, not only in Get Out, but in his second film, I think it was his second film, Us. I'm not going to be a film critic here. I think they're both really, really important. And of course, Get Out, Jordan Peele's a huge movie fan and knows his cinema history and plays with that. He pulls in the Stepford Wives big time, as well as Rosemary's Baby with Get Out. So he draws on a lot of these older histories, and then of course, connects it to race in really important ways. Us is a little bit different, but also plays into this idea of who's real, who has power, who doesn't have power, how do we know the difference? An image from the early 20th century showing, this is from 1933, showing how much human beings are relying on the machine. There are statistics given about how many people for every machine in the United States and what work is the machine doing. People are really starting to think about this. The saving of labor. This is from the early 20th century. The robot says, "Master, I can do the work of 50 men. And the white man who runs everything says, "Yes, I know that, but who will support the 50 men?" The anxiety around AI, labor, race is so deeply imbricated here. And it's all also wound up a lot with gender. I thought this was funny, not funny, haha, but also funny, disturbing. I don't want to lose my job to an illegal immigrant who can't speak English. And the robot says to the old white guy, "Don't worry, you won't." Again, deep, deep, deep connection here. And a lot of times I think even the pundits and the people who write about this for a popular audience aren't really aware of how deeply connected these things are in the history, right, of technology. So I want to end with this. I didn't get to talk a lot about transness because it's too big of a topic and one that I am not well-versed enough yet to really address. But I want to bring up a couple of different texts that I'm currently reading, which I think you might find helpful, and then we'll end it and we'll open it up for questions. An individual you should know about is Martine Rothblatt, who is a trans woman, lived her life as a man for 40 years, married with children. Also a really, really important scientist, a thinker, ethicist. She is white. Her wife of many years is African American, I believe. I mean, she's a Black woman, but I believe she's African American. They have a family. And Martine has also worked on creating a robot replica of her wife. And there, you have to explore this. It's really, really interesting. But Martine Rothblatt is also a writer and has written a lot about the relationship of transgenderism to transhumanism, and also how gender and race are deeply connected. And of course, can draw on her own experience for that and the experience of her family members. So two of her important books, From Transgender to Transhuman and Virtually Human. I also want to bring up very quickly, these are 3 books that we're going to be using in my course come June 16th. The idea of Techno-Orientalism, which is looking at how Asia has been thought of in terms of robotics and sci-fi, both in Asia itself and also in the West, and how these things feed into each other. A new book called Race After Technology, which really gets at all of the problematic issues around contemporary AI and American race and science, which we're still not addressing enough. And then finally, The American Robot, which is just come out. And Dustin Abnett looks at the whiteness and the maleness around the post-war American robot and how that has impacted industrial society and how we can bring that history to the fore so we can start seeing through it and working with all of these, working with everyone to really make this not just more inclusive, but AI is such an important part of how we live now as human beings. We all have to be working together to do this work. And I think in a way, AI is going to do it for us if we don't do it. So maybe we're all going to be brought together by this. And I'm going to end with a beautiful book I've just begun to read called Liquid Life on nonlinear materiality. I think one of the secrets to moving forward with all of this is to really start thinking about technology, AI, robotics, and human individuals as nonlinear systems and as liquid systems. I think more liquid thinking and the actual study of what a lot of people are doing around robotics, which is more liquid, like more of the wetware, is going to help us get away from this mind-body split. I mean, it's already happening on its own, but I think all of us have to become more conversant in thinking about this in new ways, because the hardware and the software are coming together, and gender and the body, as we have known them, are also being decoupled. And there's so much anxiety about that, but we've got to do it. This is the work. So thank you. I know that's a lot of information. Let's open it up for questions. And very excited about this.
Okay, wonderful. Jason, thank you so much for another brilliant talk. I see we already have some questions in the Q&A, and I just want to say again before I start sharing them, if you want to share your questions either in the Q&A or the chat, I'm very happy to share them with the speaker. So I'm going to start with the two that came earlier in the Q&A. So D. Dangeron says, interesting that gendering can happen only in a name. I want to resist and say Tommy is gender neutral, but it isn't it? Bobby would be, but not Tommy. We know nurses are disproportionately women. What implications then arise from a purposefully masculinized robot nurse? Expansive for more men to join the industry, or something more deeply problematic about making the robot a man to be closer to a doctor, disproportionately men, and protecting that disparity and more accepted by the patients?
Yes. I can't answer that question, but here's what I can say, because this is, and I'm sorry, who's this coming from?
This is from D. Dangeron.
D, I just want to say this is something that I am also trying to figure out, and what I think, and I don't think that obviously there's not one answer. Everything that you've said is so important, and it's all happening so quickly. So what I would say is, I think those who can answer that question are the people obviously who work in that industry, but also the technologists and the engineers, particularly non-male identified ones, but also male identified ones who are open to this conversation, who are on the ground, particularly as we're still in the whole COVID situation, looking at the data. Because I think a lot of this stuff has to be data driven. What we now know is what we think we know is not always going to help answer the questions about this sort of thing for us. A lot of it depends on the patient, and a lot of it, I think, depends on what administrators and the technologists want to open up to. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
Well, they also said thank you for answering their question, and they're going to email you. And I have another question, but I want to share someone else's question before going back to another by the same questioner. So Louis Sergio says, what are your thoughts on the dichotomy presented in Star Wars between the very unhuman R2-D2, who is characterized for its efficiency, and the android C3PO, who is inherently hapless and always preoccupied with the outcome of things?
Yeah, and as a lot of gay people have been pointing out, queer people, he's so queer in certain ways, right? I mean, he's kind of C3PO is sort of like based on kind of an effete late 19th century stereotype of he's British. He's a British man, and he's very sort of upper class, and it's just, there's a lot to unpack there. A lot of people are working on this. Yes, it's a great question. And what I would say is there are a lot of people working on this. I'm not a big Star Wars person, so I don't know, obviously, if I can offer you any more information, but the work is being done. People are writing about this.
Okay, so D. Dangeron had another question who says, do we risk the reification of the gender binary if we purposefully make the robots a gender that is cis-exist, opposite of the labor industries you point to, such as a woman-coded robot blacksmith? Can robots help us degender everything?
Well, I don't know. Okay, so I want to just get back to this idea of even answering that question with a yes or no, because I think there's a new type of consciousness arising that's much more like a dance. Whew, I don't even know if I have the language. I'm starting to get it, but a lot of this is still very new for me. I think there's a new type of reality that's coming where I think the technology will allow us to morph so that we can do this in a way where we as human beings won't necessarily be controlling this. It's like, how do I want to relate to the AI or the cyborg or the system? And I can come to this system as other with all the concerns that I have raised, and it will work with me to bring about, I think, a non-binary real-time relationship. And that's super exciting. And I'm not qualified to really go further on that, but I think we are all going to be pulled out of our dilemma as we start to work more with people who can help us expand even what post-gender, non-gender can mean for the future.
Okay, so we have another question from Katie Ann. Hi, Katie Ann, who says, can we please, capital please, do a Morbid Anatomy robot film club where we all track down a certain film, even on our own, and maybe once a month, and then attend a post-viewing chat with Jason? I'd love that. And Brian seconds this idea, just for your consideration, Jason.
I would love you guys. When I lived in San Francisco, we had a salon called Fantastic Cinema, which was super fun. I would do not a long lecture like this. I'd do like a little 10-minute talk with visuals, and then we'd watch the movie and we'd have a discussion. And I miss that. I miss talking to all of you smart people about these topics.
Well, our platform is at your disposal, Jason. D. Dadgeron says, again, he says, thank you so much for so beautifully answering his questions, or their questions. It says, thank you. I'm joining from Hawaii, where it's currently 6:30 a.m. because I was so excited to see this lecture. So mahalo nui for your work.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, does anyone have any other questions? And I also put into the chat a link to Jason's upcoming class if you want to go deeper into these topics. You can also find on our Patreon the talk he gave before this one, which is another free talk that you can check out. And hopefully, Jason, I know people were interested in the film clips. Maybe you'll send links to those. So when
Absolutely.
We'll send you all an email once the recording is up with links to all of the film clips you didn't get to see. So you'll get a chance.
Thank you, everyone. This is great.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thanks everyone for coming out. And you're getting lots of thanks from the audience. Amazing lecture. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming out to this talk. I hope we'll see you at future Morbid Anatomy events or classes. And I hope you'll consider taking Jason's wonderful class, and lots of love in the audience. I just hope you're taking a look, Jason.
Okay. And in my limited Portuguese, I will say obrigado.
Okay, everyone, goodbye and see you next time.
Thank you.